Narif scrolled through the catalog of available hires. The long, thin alien tried to act as though she'd done this many times while enjoying the bubbling of excitement she felt inside. She was finally getting to work with a human, something she'd been fascinated with since childhood. Having read everything she could find about them, this was her first time going on an expedition requiring not one, not two, but 3 humans. She marked her selection, watching the total change in the corner of the page. Higher skilled humans cost more, obviously, so she needed to balance her team's needs with the budget she'd been given. She finally settled on 2 males with average skill sets, well, average for humans, and 1 female with a really excellent skill set. The only reason the expedition could afford someone with her skills was that she was damaged. The catalog didn't go into details about the damage, only indicating the loss of the right arm and some personality damage from previous assignments. Narif shivered in secret delight, truth be told. The opportunity to work with a damaged human was beyond her dreams. She could explain to the team the value she'd gotten without revealing how this fit into her own plans, making it perfect. She sent the request along with the funds and the ship berth designation, then headed back to report. She held herself with her long fingers wrapping around her waist, feeling like she might explode with excitement, and held herself together in case her imagination became reality. She was a highly imaginative being and liked to imagine that her thoughts could make things so. The next morning she stepped into the hold, holding her morning stimulant. She didn't need it this morning but sipped anyway, trying to look as though this morning were no different than any other run. The 2 human males showed up first, and Narif could feel any chance of playing it cool slipping away. "Hi, I'm Narif. You must be 2 of our new humans." She could feel the feathers on her head raising in excitement and hoped the humans didn't know as much about her as she did about them. The 2 humans smiled and nodded in agreement. Smiled. She got to see a smile. If it hadn't been so undignified in a being of her age and status, Narif would have made the squeeze sound of delight that very young Elmad made. While the humans did pull their lips back and expose their teeth, she noticed the skin around their eyes didn't wrinkle, so it wasn't a true smile, just a polite gesture. Her hair drooped a little with disappointment, but she reminded herself that this was only a first meeting, not a true meeting. The humans didn't seem to be armed, which was also a disappointment after hearing so many stories about how they loved their weapons. But Narif mocked herself and pointed out they could hardly be expected to walk around with their guns waving in the air. "I'm Alan, and this handsome guy is Nate," one of the humans said. Alan's coloration was unusual for humans according to Narif's research. He was so pale that she suddenly understood why humans had labeled this skin color as white. His hair was a color that she couldn't quite place but didn't qualify as red, unless humans had more color deficits in their eyesight than her research had taught her. Nate's skin was also called white by humans, though much darker than Alan's. She began to lean toward the color deficit theory. His hair was a more common brown, the color of a key bird's wings after a molt. She held her hands out in excitement, finally getting a chance to participate in a human greeting ritual, and said, "Pleased to meet you." Alan shook her hand as she'd expected, but Nate took a little longer, switching his bag from his left hand to his right so he could shake her left hand. Alan and Nate exchanged discreet glances and small smiles that did actually reach their eyes. And Narif was delighted that their greeting had attained true greeting status. After shaking their hands exactly 2.5 times, she released their grips and said, "We have 1 more human arriving soon. After you have a chance to unpack your goods in your quarters, the entire ship will meet for a final briefing in the common area." Oh, Alan raised 1 eyebrow at her, and Narif found herself fascinated over the facial muscle control that allowed him to do that. She dug through her memory of human facial trivia and remembered that an uplifted eyebrow could mean curiosity, doubt, or sometimes humor. Who else is joining the team? A human female named Zoe. "Do you know her?" Narif asked. Alan shook his head. "Never heard of her." "But you're both human," Narif said. Not quite a protest. US and a few billion other people, Nate cut in. He swung his bag over one shoulder. "Not all of your people know each other, do you?" Narif hesitated, not sure how to reply. She could name any of her people on site, but that didn't mean she had met even a small percentage of them, and it was rude to name people before you'd had a true greeting. She wondered if "never heard of her" was a human expression about not having had a true greeting yet. "Ah, of course," she answered. "Now, could you show us to our bunks?" "Bunks?" Narif repeated the odd word. Her people prided themselves on their linguistic skills, and it hadn't occurred to her that she might need a translator. Her feathers flattened in embarrassment. He means our quarters. Nobody calls them bunks anymore, except space cowboys, Alan put in. Space cowboys? Narif repeated a little hesitantly. Cowboys are an archaic job of guarding cows from thieves and predators, like the dire wolf. Why would there be cowboys in space? Cows and their predators can't live there. Exactly, Alan said, as though she had proved a point he'd been making. But dire wolves died out a few thousand years before cowboys started working. But I had read in the novel The Old Man and The Call of the Wild about the author's battle with dire wolves on the plains and mountains of Canada, she protested. Oh, Canada, Alan and Nate exchanged those small smiles again. I wasn't thinking about Canada. Narif felt a moment of relief that her research hadn't let her down, and her feathers responded with a small lift. She turned and gestured one of the droids over. If you will please give this unit your bags, it will take you to your quarters, your bunks, she added, the new term carefully. She waved goodbye to Alan and Nate as they left the cargo hold, an energetic gesture involving flapping her hands back and forth according to the videos she had researched. Seems like a good kid, Nate said as they walked away. And she loves her some human pulp fiction, Alan agreed. Narif waited in the hold for the damaged human female to show up. How would she shake hands if the human was missing her right arm? Narif thought back over her handshake with Alan and Nate. She would just hold out both hands and let Zoe pick which one she wanted to shake. Time passed, and while Zoe was not in danger of being late, Narif would certainly agree that her arrival was delayed. Maybe Zoe had stopped on the way to the ship to get a pet. All the literature agreed that humans needed companion animals. In fact, the book The Care and Feeding of Humans specifically said that if humans were not allowed to bring their own animals with them, they were quite likely to adopt something they found on the expedition. Usually, this would be announced by the human ritual saying of "Look what followed me home." Can we keep him? This was phrased as a question, but the book had cited several expedition failures when the response had been no and strongly suggested that the question was something humans called rhetorical, which meant no response was expected. She wondered with some trepidation if Zoe would pick the smaller but more unpredictably lethal predator known as a cat, or would she pick a larger predator known as a dog, or something else? Humans were notorious for the wide range of animals they considered pets. Would she be expected to touch the predator? Narif shivered. Just as her imagination started to really pick up steam about what kind and how many predators Zoe might bring on board, a human stepped onto the deck, a bag tracking along behind her. It was definitely a her. While The Care and Feeding of Humans had said that the sexual dimorphism between humans was less than 15% across the species, Narif had no problem seeing the differences that marked Zoe as female. Her coloration was also much darker than either Nate's or Alan's, but not related to sexual dimorphism. She was also very tall for a human, coming almost to Narif's shoulder. However, Narif blinked. When she'd ordered Zoe from the catalog, it had definitely said that she was missing an arm. This human female had 2 arms. Had she already regrown her arm? Narif, I'm Zoe. Sorry I'm a little late. She smiled. It didn't touch her eyes, which were so dark they were almost black, and held out her right hand. Narif blinked. You are not late for check-in, but I'm afraid there may not be as much time for a tour of the ship before we take off. Narif shook Zoe's hand. Your pardon, but have you already regrown your arm? Zoe frowned a little. What? You are a valuable human with many valuable skills and a proven history of using those skills. Quite frankly, the only reason this expedition was able to afford 3 humans, one with your skill set, was because you were damaged and missing an arm. But Narif looked down and gestured at the 2 hands she could see. Zoe paused a moment, her face showing nothing that Narif could see as an expression. The Care and Feeding of Humans had said that reading human facial expressions was a skill that would take many years, but sometimes no visible expression meant the human had been emotionally wounded by the conversation. I'm sorry, Narif started. I did not mean to offend. I'm not offended, Zoe cut her off with a gesture. No, I have not regrown my arm. This is a prosthetic. She slid the black sleeve of her jacket up, revealing a silver arm cuff just below the elbow encircling Zoe's arm. There's the joint. They at least made it look like jewelry, but it's still just a prosthetic. Amazing. Narif bent over the arm. I have read that humans have a long history of creating artificial limbs when one of your limbs is severed. Yeah, well, Zoe pushed her sleeve back down, ending Narif's inspection. I guess we do have a long history at that. Your people don't, right? Narif stepped back and shook her head. proud that she had this human gesture down. No, while it might have been valuable in some instances, if we lost a limb, we would not live long enough for a prosthetic to help us. Zoe's face went blank again, and Narif hesitated, not sure how she had offended. True, Zoe said, and then straightened herself a little. Anyway, regrowing an arm is expensive, which is why I agreed to this expedition even after swearing. She stopped herself, lips pressed together, and then switched topics. If you could please have someone show me to my quarters. Of course. I will take you there myself, Narif said. No need. I assume you are busy before pre-flight, Zoe said. I am the liaison officer, Narif said with some pride. It is my job and my pleasure to make sure the three of you are comfortable on this trip. If you will follow me, Narif turned and headed down the same corridor that the droid had earlier led Alan and Nate. Zoe took 2 long steps to catch up and walked beside Narif, her luggage obediently trundling along behind. So there are 3 of us? Zoe asked. Narif nodded proudly. I was able to argue for a budget big enough for 3, so that you would not suffer from lack of human companionship on the trip or expedition. Lucky, Zoe muttered. Who are the other 2? They are male humans, Alan and Nate. They are already in their quarters, so you can meet them soon. Oh, and I have navigation bracelets for all 3 of you. Narif paused in front of a door and pressed a button. She then gestured to Zoe. Come and let the door scan you. Once you are scanned, you will have private access to your quarters, except in case of emergencies. Zoe nodded, not even a false smile on her face. It's not my first rodeo. Not my first rodeo? Oh, a cowboy expression meaning you have done this many times before. Nate also used a cowboy expression today. Are space cowboys common? Nate and Alan are space cowboys? Zoe asked, her voice sounding different, and Narif hesitated again. Humans were a mix of scary, strong, dangerous, and fragile, and this very expensive human was already damaged. She didn't want to make things worse, so she decided that honesty was the thing that might help most. I'm not sure, Narif said. She mentally reviewed the conversation she'd had with the males. Alan seemed to think not. She added, Are space cowboys a bad thing? Zoe snorted, and Narif immediately decided that she would practice that sound in her quarters tonight, perhaps in the rejuvenation area where no one else would hear her until she got it right. Zoe seemed to relax after the snort and finished coating her room. When the door released, Zoe walked in and motioned her luggage to a corner near the bed. She looked around the room. It was not as nice as the hospital where she had spent the last couple of months, but much nicer than any crew quarters she'd ever had before. The colors were in blues and greens with hints of purple, reminding her of Narif's coloring. The textures were rich and inviting, from a bedside table that seemed carved from driftwood to the rich, nubbly blue throw that covered the bed. She looked up and noticed Narif watching her intently. If something is not to your liking, Narif started to say, and Zoe waved her off and smiled. This smile, Narif noticed, went all the way to Zoe's eyes. She had won her first smile from the female. No, this is great, Zoe said softly. Did you decorate it, or do all the quarters look like this? Narif's light blue coloring shifted slightly to purple. Zoe was fascinated. It was like watching someone underwater with waves of soft color flowing over her. Well, Narif said, all the quarters have a bed of one kind or another and a table. But I read in the catalog that you like to read and that your favorite colors are blues and greens, so Narif trailed off. Zoe's eyes seemed wetter than normal. Narif couldn't see actual water coming out of them, so Zoe wasn't crying, but Narif mentally flailed around helplessly. The care and feeding of humans had never mentioned wet eyes. Zoe turned away from Narif abruptly and stripped off her jacket, taking care to load it into the closet. When she turned back to Narif, her eyes were no longer wet. Ah, thought Narif. It was sweat. She was hot and took off her jacket, and now she is no longer sweating. You are familiar with how to adjust the climate controls for your quarters? Narif asked. When Zoe nodded, Narif felt a flash of relief. While the temperature did not seem excessively hot to her, it was good to know that Zoe could adjust it to match her needs. Oh, your navigation bracelet. Narif put one slender hand in a pocket and pulled out a bracelet and dial. I don't think anything is scheduled before departure. We will have a meeting in the common room for the last meal and briefing updates. Zoe nodded. Thank you. I'll give you time to unpack, Narif said. Unless you want a tour of the ship now? No, thank you, Zoe added the last part almost as an afterthought. Maybe later. Narif nodded gravely. Until later, Then she left Zoe's room, and once the door closed behind her, tapped her own navigation bracelet for the quarters of Alan and Nate. She had been so excited to perform a handshake she had forgotten to give them their bracelets.